As the Germans were slowly but steadily realizing that they could not face the rising Soviet force by the fall of 1943, Hitler came up with a plan to halt the advance of one of his most hated enemies. However, the weakened Wehrmacht would have to rely on a clever and organized strategy to achieve such a colossal feat. The objective was for the Germans to seize and keep their positions along the Dnieper, a massive body of water stretching over 1,400 miles that offered a natural shield. Then, as the Soviets finally launched a hastily planned invasion, a monumental and ruthless battle ensued. It would take almost 4 months for a front to emerge victorious, as not even nature could hold back Stalin's Red Army and their thirst for conquest. Change of tides. After the terrible German defeat in the largest tank battle in history at Kursk in August of 1943, Adolf Hitler realized that his forces in the southern Soviet Union were highly vulnerable. There had already been signs that they were being defeated, and the Germans under General von Manstein had been ordered to erect an improvised defensive line along the Ostwall, or East Wall, on August 11th. Moreover, they were to use one of Europe's largest rivers, the Dnieper, as a natural barrier to halt an upcoming Red Army advance. The Wehrmacht had lost its lead in the war and had no other choice than to retreat westward, hoping that a devised line of fortifications from the Baltic to the Azov Sea would be enough to, as Hitler said, quote, protect Europe from Bolshevism. A key element of the East Wall, the Dnieper was 18 kilometers wide at some spots, but about 3 kilometers at its lowest part. Moreover, its western shore was much higher and steeper than the eastern, providing a natural geographic advantage for the Germans, who were in dire need of help. Even though the Soviets had suffered more losses during the summer, it was the Germans that were rendered more vulnerable. Attempting to handle a war at 2 fronts, while simultaneously offering assistance to their allies in the Mediterranean, their forces were critically thin. To make matters worse, the short amount of time available made it impossible for the Germans to complete their defensive line, and only an unevenly dense and deep fortification stood in the way of an unstoppable communist army. If the Germans could gain a foothold on the western bank, their chances of stopping the Soviets would drastically increase. Their strategy was to inflict as many losses on the Red Army as possible while attempting to cross the imposing waterfront. However, the Soviets knew better, and their military command ordered its troops to advance to the Dnieper without delay, as Boris Egorov from Russia Beyond put it, quote, without resting on its laurels. Strategies. Soviet political leader Joseph Stalin seized the opportunity to attack the weakened German forces, and on August 26th, the Red Army launched a massive mobilization of over 2.6 million troops that were to cover the 1,400-kilometer front. Knowing that such a strategy would imply more casualties than penetrating or encircling the Germans, the Soviets aimed to disrupt their foes' supply lines, relying on the partisan warfare behind the German front. A brutal fight soon followed. Outnumbered, the Germans knew they had to execute a superior strategy. Thus, they contested towns and cities in Ukraine, assigning rear guards in urban and rural areas, as well as critical hills. The approach succeeded in delaying the Soviet advance, but cost them massive casualties. Furthermore, on September 7th, a scorched earth policy was implemented, and every inch the Germans retreated, they ravaged. 3 weeks into the fight, the Germans learned that they would not be able to contain the offensive in the open steppes. Therefore, General Manstein asked for no fewer than 12 new divisions, but such numbers were absurd for a dismembered Wehrmacht. On September 15th, Hitler had Army Group South fall back to the Dnieper defense line. The German fortifications stood on the east side of the river, whereas the steep embankments on the western shore would prevent the Soviets from establishing bridgeheads, and more importantly, lodgements across the Dnieper. One especially bitter encounter took place in Poltava, in central Ukraine. When the Soviets couldn't secure the city after a few days, they resolved to bypass the site and rush towards the river. In the end, the city was taken by the communists, who reached the low Dnieper towards the end of the month. By the end of the month, the Red Army had secured at least 23 bridgeheads. Meanwhile, the cornered Germans were forced to evacuate across the river. Private Guy Sager recalled, quote, "We're on the other side. The western bank means security, a border that firmly separates us from the Russians." Official reports stated that German troops would halt the Dnieper, and that in the spring we would push the Russians across the Volga River. The Germans then retreated, forcibly taking the locals on their way to supplement their own workforce, while preventing the Red Army from replenishing its ranks. Upset about the heavy casualties they had suffered, plus the lack of progress at the riverside, the Soviets then launched an airborne assault, one so lousy they would never try it again. Leap into the unknown. Having raced the Germans to the river and sensing a critical juncture, the Soviets launched a hastily planned airborne assault. On September 24th, after a one-day delay due to the weather conditions and the High Command's chaotic organization, poorly provisioned paratroopers were dropped right above the German positions. In fact, half the 4,000 men deployed had never parachuted, except for training tower exercises. Meanwhile, most radios and equipment were left behind, and the weather conditions had made it impossible for the Soviets to conduct recent aerial reconnaissance, thus failing to recognize the strong German reinforcements in the area. More than a quarter of the paratroopers never made it to land, as they were met with unexpected tank fire, and their attempts to return fire and throw grenades were futile. Then Junior Sergeant Pyotr Nazivenko recalled, quote, "There were 6 divisions concentrated there and 2 tank corps, and we were dropped on their positions. We went into battle straight from the sky and died in the sky. Everything was on fire there. Night turned into day. The whole brigade should have landed within a radius of 7 to 10 kilometers, but the pilots scattered us across 100 kilometers, from Rzhivtsev to Cherkasy. And instead of acting as a brigade, we had to operate in small detachments that were easy to destroy. Those who managed to land were scattered and isolated, and the Germans would lure the confused detachments with white parachutes to hunt them down, as well as gather airdropped supplies. Moreover, seized documents gave the Germans an advantage, as they knew the Soviet objectives and arrived at most of them before the disorganized paratroopers. Still, the Germans underestimated the numbers of Soviet paratroopers, believing there had been from 1,500 to 2,000. In addition, they recorded 901 captured and neutralized soldiers on the first day, thinking they'd controlled half of the Soviet forces. Up in the air, several Soviet aircraft were shot down for flying too low. Thus, many aircraft aimed too high, leading to a significant number of paratroopers falling into the river and drowning. The survivors could barely do anything to contribute to the overall battle. However, the Germans recognized the individual tenacity of the airborne corps, despite the lack of expertise of the Soviet command. The dismantled troops eventually returned to the main forces, but more than 60% of the original force did not. Winners and losers. By early October, most Soviet divisions in the north were at less than half their original strength. They would soon make a swift advance, but at a high cost. Despite fierce German counterattacks on almost every bridgehead, the defenders could not stop the Soviet forces before they transported their heavy equipment across the river. Still, they hit the Soviets at a rate of 1 to 3 and were close to defeating them. Ultimately, the Soviets were able to hold every lodgment they'd secured, but lost about half their forces. Armies and divisions worked independently, and the Red Army eventually defeated the Wehrmacht. The Soviets would also use diversionary techniques to achieve victory, creating false attempts to cross 10 or 15 kilometers and draw the defenders' attention away from the real action. Those who made it first to the other side were light travelers, deprived of heavy armored vehicles and enough ammunition or food. Throughout the month, the fight for the Western Bank only escalated, right up until the military and political triumph from the liberation of Kiev on November 6th. The feat resulted in the strategic control of Crimea and the subsequent Soviet advance into Eastern Europe. The Germans would try to recapture the Ukrainian capital for another 6 weeks, but it was useless. The Soviets had emerged victorious, and the Germans were exhausted and diminished. Ultimately, about 300,000 Germans perished in the battle, while the Soviets endured 1.6 million casualties. Those were more losses than the United States had in the entire war. Still, the USSR valued the heroism and sacrifice of their soldiers, and a total of 2,438 men were bestowed with the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the largest number in any operation during World War II. By then, the Eastern Wall had been breached, and the Soviet dominance in the continent was only a matter of time. The following year, Lithuania, Belarus, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria would fall under communist control. Thank you for watching my video. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like, and feel free to leave us a comment in the section below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to all of our Dark Documentaries channels to learn more about the global conflict, and hit the bell icon to be notified of our newest content. Stay tuned.